how much do you think the Indian media as such has been committed in safeguarding Indian democracy?
Um, are you already loading? You want to?
Again, no, you have to say.
No, no, but is the sound okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I think it won't be right to talk about commitment in the sense of a conscious effort by the media to promote democracy. It's rather the function that the media plays, okay? By virtue of being the media, by virtue of communicating with the larger public, by informing it, by creating a forum for debate on policy issues of public interest and so on. In this sense, I think the media's role has been extremely important and irreplaceable. Let me just take 2 or 3 examples. India and China, for something like 30 years after independence, after Indian independence, had roughly the same rate of agricultural growth, same rate of growth of food production. But China had a number of famines in which millions of people perished, millions died, and India had very few such famines, and the number of deaths doesn't exceed some thousands. It's nowhere near the kind of million level that China has. And the reason for this is not really that the Chinese government had a very bad or weak distribution system, and the Indian government had a much better system. It's really the critical difference, as Professor Amartya Sen has pointed out, is that you had a free press in India which reported on famine deaths, which embarrassed the government, which was forced to take action. Right. Similarly, I think what happened in the emergency and immediately after the emergency, through the exposure of the misdeeds of and the misgovernance of Mrs. Gandhi's regime, her repressive measures, popular resistance to those measures, the compromised nature of a number of politicians, but the people's interest in preserving freedom and liberty was very, very important in the way the media dealt with the issue. So I would say it contributed in a, in an enormously positive way to the strengthening and deepening of democracy in India.
Do you think the health of a democracy can be measured by the fact that there is a free media?
Oh yes, I would say that if you had an index of what constitutes democracy and you had a number of factors, for instance, free and fair elections, of course that's the most important condition, universal adult franchise and so on and so forth, institutionalized political liberties, freedom of expression, participation of people in the political process and so on, such factors, I would rate the freedom of expression as very, very high, perhaps within the first 3 of any 10 factors that you would use to evaluate the functioning of a true liberal democracy in which people have a stake.
But talking about free press, do you think there is a free press in India today?
Yes, I think our press is largely free, although it's owned by a very small minority of rich people. Look, free press has 2 aspects. One is the freedom to own and launch newspapers. I think this freedom is, of course, very much there, but it's in practice not extended to everybody because it takes a lot of money to launch a newspaper or even to sustain a magazine. Publications economics are very, very adverse, or to produce television programs you need equipment which is expensive and so on and so forth. So this freedom in practice is limited to a relatively privileged minority. Also, it's very difficult to run some of these media without advertising, and advertising won't come the way of, let's say, a newspaper which is radical, which is left-wing, or a television program which is devoted to science, or which is devoted to good high culture. It will, on the other hand, go to the most atrocious, pop music-based programs or film-based programs, or vulgar sort of shows like the Spice Girls and so on. So in practice, that freedom is not that great. But the other aspect of media freedom is that without being held back by the government. And I think that freedom has been by and large quite substantial. It has expanded in many ways. In the 50s and the 60s, the Indian media would be far less critical of the government of the day, of its foreign policy, of its security policy, of its policy on Kashmir, its policy on Nagaland in the northeast, of its nuclear policy. Today you see that there is much more criticism, there's much more balanced analysis, there's much more, I mean, I'm not saying it's entirely balanced, but there is less imbalance than there used to be. There is a freer debate, there is a more informed debate on many of these issues. You can't have 100 people killed in Kashmir in a single incident and the incident going unreported. You can't have the kind of repression that the Indian Army practiced, I'm afraid, in Nagaland in the 50s and the 60s today without the media covering it extensively. Now, again, you won't have rape and molestation of women or atrocities like sati and so on and so forth without the media coming in and publicizing these events. And I think this is a very important dimension of the role of the media in providing information. You can't have genuine democracy unless people have the basis on which to intervene in decision making, and that basis is information. They must know what decisions the government is making, on what basis it's making them, how they're affecting different kinds of people and different groups in society, and what might be an alternative to those decisions and those policies. And the media plays an absolutely irreplaceable role in providing that information in a relatively open, balanced way. There are biases that creep in, but on the whole, I think the Indian media has played a marvelous role in providing that information. Again, there are very few fora of public debate left in this country. Unfortunately, Parliament has ceased to be a great forum, the great forum that it used to be at one time. You see, the quality of parliamentary and legislative debate has greatly declined over the years. But the media, in many ways, has tended to at least provide a forum of public debate on very important issues. And I think this is, again, a very, very valuable role indeed, which you cannot easily replace with any other institution.
Let's talk about investigative journalism in India. In many ways, I think it has been responsible in not only exploring scams, but do you think also in toppling some of the governments? Can you give few instances where?
Yes, I think one can talk about at least 3 or 4 major instances where media exposés embarrass governments to the point of them losing elections. One of the most recent examples, I think, is of course the Narasimha Rao government in many ways. I think the Hawala scam, the urea import scandal, the securities scam, and so on and so forth, all involved actions and decisions and policies of the Narasimha Rao government. And personally, I think Mr. Rao was involved in some of these scams directly, including the Hawala case and the Chandraswamy case and so on. And I think his exposure by the media played a major role in lowering the credibility and popularity of the Congress and in showing its right-wing character and in diminishing support and votes for the Congress. The same thing happened with Rajiv Gandhi over Bofors in 1989. I think it could be confidently said that one of the main reasons why the Congress lost the election that year was the Bofors scam. A still more recent example is what happened to Jayalalitha in Tamil Nadu. I think she was definitely implicated in numerous scams, and the media exposed them. For instance, the coal import scandal, the wedding of a godson in which crores of rupees were spent. The way I think the media very responsibly documented how favors were granted, undue favors were granted at state expense to her cronies and so on, played a major role. Earlier, I think in the case of Jagannath Mishra, the 2 two things I think mattered a lot. One was his attempt to muzzle the media, and he brought the Bihar Press Bill. This is in the early 80s, and he had to pay very heavily for it because there was a national campaign amongst all media people, irrespective of political affiliation, nature of media, rural-urban differences and so on, which led to a tremendous embarrassment for Jagannath Mishra. And at the same time, I think his involvement in numerous instances of misgovernance and non-performance played a role. I think the same thing is happening to some extent in the case of Lalu Prasad Yadav and the fodder scam, although here I see that there is a certain prejudice also at work from upper caste journalists who seem to assume that he must be corrupt. If you actually go into some of the allegations that have been leveled by people like Mr. Biswas, they're not that well documented. So I would reserve my judgment, but definitely the general impression because of which Lalu Prasad Yadav is today in jail has a lot to do with what the media reported on these matters.
We are talking about do you think that the press has been vigilant in India? I am also talking about the number of publications, magazines, newspapers which have now come in the market.
Vigilant?
Yeah. Has it been vigilant in terms of like keeping an eye on the Indian system and Indian happenings?
Well, in many ways, I think newspapers have been very, very vigilant, and I would say that magazines have been much less so. Magazines in India tend to have got, I think they've got yuppified over the past couple of decades. They've become very glossy. Magazine economics favors a certain kind of elitism because you spend a lot of money. To recover that money, you need to advertise to get very heavy doses of advertisement, and you become very glossy, and you become glossy. Your appeal to the elite, to the upper middle class and the upper class increases, but then that means also that you're catering increasingly to those layers of the population, which are probably just 2 or 3% of the total population. And you then tend to weave in that bias in your own writing, the choice of subjects, in what you will cover and not cover. So you want to do, instead of pursuing, let's say, issues such as poverty, illiteracy, how funds are wasted, which ought to be invested in the social sector, and so on. You will want to do glamour stories, more and more of these. So I think that influence is increasing in magazines, and there's less and less of a difference between, let's say, India Today and Outlook and Sunday and so on. I mean, Sunday used to be, for instance, a fine investigative magazine at one time. Today it's a very poor imitation of India Today or something like that. But in the case of newspapers, you don't see that kind of bias in the same way, certainly not a strong bias, and you have a tremendous amount of I think a tremendous range of subjects on which newspapers write, both on their in their news pages and their features pages and in their comment spaces. And you find that it's not only politics, it's social issues, it's security issues, it's foreign affairs, it's culture and so on that they're catering to. And I think that in that sense the newspapers are far more vigilant because they keep an eye on what's going on in a number of walks of life. And
what about region?
I think the regional press has been through a huge boom, and it's still booming. And I mean, in languages like Hindi, you've had a tremendous efflorescence, flowering of the press, of new papers, of many editions, of different kinds of papers, specialty papers, including financial and economic papers and so on and so forth. Also, circulations have multiplied much more rapidly than in the case of the English press. Similarly, I think radio has undergone a tremendous change, not so much because of FM, but in fact All India Radio has itself improved tremendously, and its regional coverage has substantially gone up. Although I think the upper class elite has increasingly deserted radio as a medium and is concentrating a lot on television. I can't say the same thing about television with the same confidence, but I think the regional media as a whole has probably expanded more rapidly than the national media, English language media, and that's again a very positive sign. Of course, a lot needs to be done. For instance, I'm just appalled that to this day you have weather reports on Doordarshan or on ZTV which treat this vast country with some 20 odd agroclimatic zones as if it consisted of 4 corners. You know, you get temperatures in Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta and Madras, which I think is ridiculous. I mean, you should get temperatures in Srinagar, you should get temperatures in Kanyakumari, you should get temperatures in Pondicherry, you should get them in Goa, you should get them, why Bombay? What's so great about Bombay apart from the fact that, a certain number of people live there? And it's such a varied country, and yet you have, the point I'm making is this, that the national media is often slow to catch up with what is actually happening on the ground, and the great federalism that we have seen boom. There's in practice a great decentralization of many activities taking place, which is very, very positive indeed, and the media has responded at the regional level to this, but not at the national level.
The growth of regional media.
Yeah, I think over the past decade, there's been a huge boom in the regional media. There's been a flowering of newspapers, magazines, and so on. And in languages like Hindi, their growth has been particularly remarkable.
How do you think the president's role in taking this decision as such? Do you think the president took the right decision?
Oh, absolutely. I think he took a very courageous decision by asking the cabinet to reconsider its advice to him to dissolve the UP Assembly and impose president's rule. I think here you have after many decades actually, a president in the grand tradition of Dr. Radhakrishnan or Dr. Zakir Hussain, a very learned man, a man of deep commitment and values, high values and moral principles, who knows what is legal, what is correct, what is good for democracy. And I think he gave very sagacious advice to the cabinet, citing the importance of understanding the Bomai case judgment, not just as a legal judgment, but as enjoining a certain kind of conduct on the part of the governor and the central government, and respecting the fact that a majority of the legislators had voted for Kalyan Singh. Now, it's another matter that very significant numbers of those had been bought up. There was horse trading of the worst variety. The BJP stooped to the lowest, the meanest possible level. It broke its own promise. Mr. Vajpayee had made a promise in May last year when he was facing a vote of confidence in Parliament. He said, I will never touch power which comes to us, to the BJP, through the breaking up of other parties, through a breach of principles. I will never touch power where that power is based on something unprincipled and lack of dignity, right? Yeah, I think the BJP indulged in the most shameless variety of opportunism in Lucknow in the last fortnight. I mean, it was buying up MLAs, it was inducing defections actively, it was promising them ministerships and paying out huge sums of money. And that in this sense, it completely violated all parliamentary norms, all sort of notions of responsible political behavior, all notions of public morality, and its own solemn pledge. Last year, when he was facing the vote of no confidence in May, Mr. Vajpayee, who was Prime Minister for a very short period of time, pledged that the BJP would never accept support which involved breach of principles and which involved breaking up of parties or defections. He said he would not touch power that came to the BJP through breaches of principles and through defections, even with a barge pole. Even if it came, even if it was offered to him, he wouldn't touch it with the barge pole. But look at what the BJP has done. I mean, it is so gross, it is so disgusting, it is so repulsive, right? And yet I think once the vote was ordered in fact by Ramesh Bhandari and allowed to take place, then the governor had no role. If the speaker in fact colluded with the BJP in rigging the vote, then that matter can be taken up later. If indeed it is true that he played a very dubious role in allowing 12 BSP MLAs to sit on the treasury benches, knowing fully well that they do not represent 1/3 of the party's strength in Parliament, in the Assembly, which is 67, and therefore would be disqualified under the anti-defection law. Even assuming that that is the case, their vote does not become invalid on that ground. Okay? In fact, to invoke the anti-defection law, you have to show that they actually voted, and that vote counts, that vote remains valid. But precisely because they voted without, against their own party's directive and whip, they can be disqualified under the Anti-Defection Act. Now, these are complicated issues, but the point is, prima facie, there was a vote, there was a certain amount of violence, but perhaps not enough to justify nullifying the vote. And I think it seems quite clear that the United Front government was wrong in the first instance to advise the president to impose his rule on UP, and the president was very, very wise and sagacious and statesmanlike indeed when he referred the matter back to the cabinet under Article 74 of the Constitution. I think it redounds to the credit of many people in the United Front that having made a mistake, they at least accepted that they had done so and learned and corrected their ways in the nick of time. I think this is an unprecedented thing, and unprecedented development, and both because the president for the first time sends a decision back formally to the cabinet, and because the cabinet then really does reconsider it.